Welcome to West Sound Academy's first Parent Education Seminar. Tonight we're going to be talking about cyber citizenship, student, family, school, and beyond.
So my name is David Franklin, and this is Diana Jackson, and we're just going to talk a little bit about our background before we start. So I have been a coach, facilitator, and trainer for about the past 10 years. I work with organizations to strengthen leadership, create more community and team building, and to help both organizations and the individuals within those organizations to thrive. And I also work with men to promote conscious leadership, improve communication, and develop and cultivate healthy and satisfying relationships. And for me, this topic is really relevant, partly as a step-parent to a 7-year-old, and just partly as someone who observes the impact of technology on our culture and on society. And just noticing that there's a lot of ways that we take technology for granted and the impact of it for granted without really looking at how technology does affect us. And one of the things that has inspired me in this arena, I read a book many years ago called In the Absence of the Sacred by a man named Jerry Mander. And one of the things he said was looking at technology, rather than looking at it as innocent until proven guilty, looking at technology as guilty until proven innocent. So really being willing to examine the potential impacts of technology and how they can alter our relationships and our lives. And so coming into this presentation, part of my goal is to just take a really objective look at technology and look at both the pros and cons and how it impacts us.
So as David said, my name is Diana Jackson, and I'm a marriage and family therapist associate on Bainbridge Island. And I have been a part of the West Sound Academy community since 2005 in one capacity or another, with a 2-year break in order to go back to school to become a therapist. And one of the things that drew me to West Sound Academy from the very beginning was the value it places on critical thinking. I think that our presentation tonight is timely and very much a part of what is now a tradition of critical thinking at West Sound Academy. We're going to start with an overview of tonight.
So first we're just going to talk about our goal for this evening, and that will be followed by Diana talking about some presentations she gave here at West Sound Academy to some 6th and 10th graders. So Diana met with some of the students here and talked about some of the same things we're going to be talking about tonight. And so she'll just be giving a recap of what that experience was like and the kinds of things that she covered. Diana's also going to talk a little bit about the teenage brain and how it works. And lastly, we're going to talk about some advantages and disadvantages of internet and cell phone use.
And our last topic is it takes a village to raise a cyber citizen.
So our goal for tonight is to give a presentation of resources to help you stay connected with your teen and, of course, your pet in the digital age.
So, since our goal is to stay connected, I wanted to give sort of a pitch for connection from a psychological point of view or from an anthropological point of view. If I know anything about human beings, it's that we really strive to remain connected with other human beings and to be connected to other human beings. And PBS had a special just about this sort of thing called This Emotional Life, Connection with Others. And during this special, what we learned is that belonging to a community gives us a sense of identity. We know who we are when we are with other humans that we're connected to. Researchers have found that people are happier when they're with other people than when they are alone. And happiness may be surprisingly contagious. The positive effects of connecting with one another are lasting as well. I was able to give presentations to the 6th through 10th graders at West Sound Academy, and I want to give you an idea in review of what they covered. So with the 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, I presented to them the findings of a Pew Internet and American Life Project press release. In this, we talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly of internet use. I had them think about the differences between face-to-face and Facebook connections. And we also worked on scenarios in which they would communicate different events using either face-to-face communication or text communication. They also worked really hard to come up with a declaration of internet independence. With the 9th and 10th graders, we did all of the above. And I also spoke to them about a new category of disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual called the Internet Use Disorder. We had a few discussions about this, and I let them know that there's lots of controversy around this particular disorder and its inclusion in the book. We talked about the advantages of being connected and not being connected. So our question is, how can you connect with your teen?
So just take a few moments if you're watching this at home to think about ways that you can start to initiate these conversations with your teen. So if you need to pause the video right now, just take a few moments to do so. You might even want to write down some ideas that come to you. So I want to talk a little bit about disconnects in a digital age. So there's a number of disconnects that we've identified in the context of this presentation. The first one is a disconnection from feelings. So one of the side effects from technology can be a lack of empathy and dissociation. We see this on message boards where people can say sometimes really cruel and harsh things without really seeing the impact it has on someone else who they're speaking with. We see this in terms of ways that people are more comfortable relating to technology than they are to people who might even be in their presence, they might actually be spending time with. One of the interesting statistics or facts around technology is, particularly in watching television, is that researchers have identified different levels of consciousness, and 4 of those basic levels being beta, alpha, theta, and delta. And what researchers have found is that watching TV actually brings people into an alpha level, which is, in a sense, of the 4 tiers, it's the 2nd level. So our everyday consciousness, we tend to be in beta. But when we watch TV, we actually enter alpha, which is a very similar level of consciousness to one who's meditating, doing very serious meditation. And so what that means is when people are watching TV, they actually enter a more meditative state. But the difference between that and something like meditating is that they're in a passive receptive state. So anything that they're seeing on the screen is entering into their mind and into their awareness. And so a lot of times, this is one of the impacts of technology, such as television, is that we're receiving a lot of stimulus and information that we're not really even able to selectively filter and really make conscious choices about how we want to actually engage with the material that's being presented to us, which is different than being in meditation, where we're much more in control and much more actively entering a different level of consciousness rather than passively. Technology can also, as I alluded to a moment ago, create a disconnect in our relationships. So we might have an inability to find harmony and resolve conflict, particularly through technological means. It's a lot more difficult when emotions get higher or anxiety increases to actually resolve and work through some of those feelings. There's also a difference between online and real life status. It becomes harder to differentiate between the two. We become so used to relating through technology that we forget how to relate to people on an everyday basis in our lives. There's also a disconnect from community. There's a lack of accountability. So on the internet, you can say whatever you want. You can say whatever statistics or facts you want, and often there's not necessarily a lot of information to actually back it up. You can also say, as I alluded to before, you can say something really negative to someone or about someone, and there's no way to really hold anyone accountable for what they say, even if it does severely or significantly impact someone. There's also, kind of paradoxically, that this sense of being alone in a crowd of others who are alone in a crowd. So on one hand, we think that we're actually engaging more in community, but there's a way that we can feel alone as we're, let's say we're on the internet, and we're connecting to other people who, again, aren't actually with us. There's a sense of a craving for connection, and so finding that through technology rather than being able to actually create it in everyday life, again, with real flesh and blood people. And lastly, there's a disconnect from the world. So the priority is given to a more mediated experience, again, relating through something rather than directly relating to someone. And there's also a lack of awareness of our environment. So for example, driving while being on a cell phone or texting in public, we kind of lose sight of what's happening around us. We we fail to become aware of people who are around us or even other things that are going on in our world. So those are just that's a summary of some aspects of disconnects in the digital age.
So the burning question tonight, how can you connect with your team? I think we can best begin to answer this question by knowing a few things about the teen brain. This represents what happens to our brain from the age of 5 to the age of 20. And while I can't go into all the details of those changes, one of the things that I can tell you is that the teen brain is at a human peak for learning. In other words, when we're teenagers, we learn more than we will at any other point in our life, more than when we're toddlers, and certainly more than when we're middle-aged. So, at this peak learning capacity, how can you connect with your team? And what are some of the impacts of connecting with the internet and cell phone use? Let's just take a look here for a moment. More about the teenage brain. The part of our brain that processes information expands during childhood and then begins to thin, peaking in girls at roughly 12 to 14 years old and in boys about 2 years later. And some more information. Nature made the brains of children and adolescents excitable. Their brain chemistry is tuned to be responsive to everything in their environment. After all, that's what makes kids learn so easily. So, in review, your teen's brain is extraordinary. It's excitable, and it's also responsive. It is literally wired to make new connections. That's its job. So the good news and the bad news. After all, if the brain is wired to form new connections in response to the environment, and when potent psychoactive drugs suddenly enter that environment, those substances are, as pediatric neurologist Frances Jensen says, tapping into a much more robust habit-forming ability that adolescents have compared to adults. So what Richard Knox is alluding to via Frances Jensen's work in pediatric neurology is that the teen brain has a robust habit-forming ability, and this can be used for either good or bad. If your teen is going to have habits, they're going to be quickly learned, and they're going to stay around. They're going to be robust. So let's see some examples of the extraordinary learning capacity, excitability, and robustness of your teen's brain at work. Think about this for a moment. When have you seen that brain at its peak learning capacity? So connect to your teen's hyper-connecting brain by first knowing what environment your teen is wired to. What is that brain exposed to? What is the neighborhood it's wandering around in? Knowing what is in that environment will also help you to connect. And knowing what skills and habits of connection your teen is learning.
So coming back again to advantages and disadvantages of internet and cell phone use, particularly as you think of your teen and even as you think of yourself. We're going to start by looking at how these media are similar. So some of the ways that we identified that they are similar. They're fast, indirect, public. They're portable, inexpensive, accessible, and ubiquitous. So we're going to look at the pros and cons of each one of these aspects. So some of the advantages, coming back to speed again, are that you can share information in a matter of seconds. The indirectness allows people to exchange information remotely in any part of the world. The information is public, so there's worldwide dissemination of communication and information, so anything that needs to be announced into the world or communicated to people can happen in a matter of seconds. And the technology is portable, so it's inexpensive. almost anyone can have access to it. So there's very few limitations or barriers to people actually being able to use these kinds of technologies. Some of the disadvantages with some of these commonalities between the internet and cell phones are, if you look again at speed, there's a lack of subtle information. A lot gets lost in the communication and in the exchange. Because of the indirectness, there's a lack of intimacy, and again, a lack of empathy, as I talked about earlier, in terms of the disconnects. Because they're all public, there's no privacy. Once you enter into that world, your privacy is definitely compromised. Or again, you're able to enter into it anonymously, which creates a different kind of disconnection. Because you're not actually, there's a breakdown in terms of intimacy and being able to really be seen by other people. Because it's portable and inexpensive, it's difficult to monitor or regulate. People can pretty much do or say just about whatever they want, again, with minimal accountability. And there's also just the exposure to harmful or dangerous people or situations. So, for example, even a child can end up clicking or landing on a pornographic website, or you can find disturbing images on the internet. Or it's possible for dangerous people to potentially solicit minors or engage in harmful behavior. Obviously we see a lot about internet scams and things like that. So the risks become a lot higher with these kinds of technologies. So overall, in summary, the number one hazard is a disconnection from a full range of emotions and full range of relationships. And so in this little cartoon here, which I think is from the New Yorker, this patient on the couch is saying, "Can we up the dosage? I still have feelings." And with all this technology, it becomes a way of numbing or damping down, again, a lot of intimacy, a lot of our relationships and emotions. And in some ways, it's the symptom of a culture where we are afraid to feel or resistant to actually feel our emotions. There's a sense of being out of control once we start to feel more. And so technology in some ways is both a symptom of our hesitancy or resistance to feeling, as well as something that perpetuates it.
So, as we start to conclude our presentation, I want to invite you to consider the fact that it takes a village to raise a cyber citizen. So, what can you do to help your team navigate the hazards of cyberspace? Encourage all teams to want the best and to accept only the ideal. The best and ideal of internet and cell phone connection, and the best and ideal of face-to-face connection. So what are some of the internet and cell phone ideals? How can these media connect us to emotions and relationships? They're ideal for quick, impersonal communication. They're ideal for research and learning, and they're ideal for emergencies. They're also ideal for announcements, resources, and opportunities, and ideal for networking. However, they're not ideal for communicating messages containing emotional content. Not ideal for assuming accurate sources of information, and they're not ideal for addressing conflicts and disagreements, nor are they ideal for sustained learning, development, and decision-making. And as we've hit upon a number of times, they're not ideal for developing relationships.
And so one of the things to consider in terms of the ideals or not ideals are how we're actually choosing to use the technology. So to some degree, we're limited by the range of technology and what it can offer us, in this case, the internet and cell phones. But at the same time, as we're using it, we can start to learn, okay, and make choices around what are the ways that we can actually use technology to our advantage, where are the ways that its strengths can actually be utilized. So, we've seen different examples of being able to get important information out to a wide group of people about current events or situations that really need immediate attention. Obviously, we've been in situations where having a cell phone has come in really handy to save lives in the case of an emergency. Or being able to send a quick message to someone can be helpful to say, hey, I'm running 5 minutes late. And so those are some ways that we can actually use technology to help us. And yet at the same time, we have to be aware of its limitations and know, okay, it's not ideal let's say we're having a conflict with someone, or we're really feeling something strongly that we want to communicate, to realize, okay, technology is there, but I'm going to make the choice to actually get together face to face with someone and actually have a conversation. Or if I'm wanting to engage in deeper relationship or build community, to actually make an effort with the people around me rather than trying to go through people who I don't really even know that well. So being aware, again, of where can we make choices that are going to create more healthy relationships that we really want, and not settle for ones that end up being either mediocre or where there's a lot of potential for disconnection.
I also want to take a moment to talk with you about something that has become of national concern, and this is developing relationships among digital natives. This has begun to happen through a phenomenon called sexting. And sexting is defined in the following way. When people take and send sexually revealing pictures of themselves or send sexually explicit messages via text message, it's called sexting. While experts differ on statistics, a 2010 study conducted by Pew Internet and American Life Project confirms sexting is a teen reality that is here to stay. Kids sext to show off, to entice someone, to show interest in someone, or to prove commitment. So we would encourage you to take on a few talking points in your conversation to your kids about sexting. The most important thing is that you actually talk to them. Let them know that there is no privacy in internet and cell phone use. You might like to let them know also that the University of Utah Department of Psychology researchers surveyed 606 teens aged 14 to 18 and found that approximately 20% of the teens said they had sent a sexual image of themselves via cell phone. 1/3 of the teens stated that they didn't think about the legal ramifications or consequences of their actions. So, just so you know, in the state of Washington, here are the legal ramifications. Under Washington law, individuals who distribute, produce, or possess a sexually explicit image of a minor could be charged with a felony under the state's child pornography statutes. If the individual is convicted, they could receive up to 10 years in jail, as well as be required to register as a sex offender. Researchers at the University of Texas Medical Branch have found the following things to be true. Teens who sext may be more likely to engage in sexual behaviors. And 28% of teens admitted to having sent a sext. 76.2% of teens who were propositioned to sext admitted to having had sexual intercourse. Girls were asked to send a sext 68% more often than boys were, at 42%. The peak age of sexting is around 16 and 17 years of age. And sexting seems to decline in individuals 18 and older.
So take some time with your team to discuss some of the hazards and ideals. You can refer to some of the ones that we've talked about tonight. You might also make a list of some other things that we haven't covered. So rather than go in with an agenda, to create an open dialogue and really explore what are some of the hazards, what are some of the ideals, and really talk about the ways that you notice the impact in your lives. Rather than keeping it hypothetical or theoretical, actually look at what are some of the consequences to us being on the internet, us being on the phone, how we communicate with one another, and just really notice the impact. And then make a list and write down what you come up with as a future reminder. You might want to post it somewhere where you can refer to it regularly. As part of that, you might want to create a family constitution of cyber citizenship. So that can be a more official document or agreement about how technology will or won't be used. And so use that list as a starting point to create such a document. So we want to talk about some practical considerations for internet and cell phone use. And these are things when you refer to your declaration of cyber citizenship or make agreements with your teams that you can consider in your discussion. Some talking points or some potential boundaries. So you might want to limit use, such as the amount of time per day on the internet or cell phone for your team. You might want to consider how much you monitor usage And again, as I mentioned earlier, there's no need, in terms of privacy, and as Diana mentioned, your teen's brain is very susceptible to a lot of stimulus and influence. And so you want to be really aware of what kinds of things your teen is exposed to. And again, some parents may be hesitant to monitor their teen's usage or to see what they're looking at or who they're talking to. But at the same time, it's extremely important to be aware of what your teen is influenced by. And so don't be afraid to actually set healthy boundaries and to actually see what they're looking at and talk with them about it, to engage in discussion. Again, there's so much potential for harmful input that you really want to know. And again, as we talked about earlier, there's such easy access to some of these things that you really want to know what your teen is actually doing. Talk about your feelings and theirs around internet, cell phone, and technology. And just engage in an open, curious discussion. Be really willing to hear what they have to say, as well as to not be afraid of what you have to say, to express what you have to say. Address concerns or hazards as they come up, or ahead of time. So maybe talk about some of the things going into such an agreement that might be challenging or difficult to prepare yourselves. Also be willing, if you make agreements, to potentially change or talk about things as they come up. So some of the agreements might turn out to be a lot harder than your teen anticipated, and they might have feelings as some of those things come up. So be willing just to engage in an ongoing dialogue around what's actually happening. Obviously, notice the impact of technology around your relationship. So notice if having technology around is creating more disharmony and disconnection in your family, or if it's helping create more connection in your family. And just be willing to take an objective look. If you find yourself often together, but while you're in the same room, everyone's on their own phones doing something, or you're all just sitting around watching a lot of TV, or everyone's on their own computers rather than actually talking with each other, maybe listening to music, making food together, having good conversation. Just notice again, be willing to look at what kind of relationships do you want to have with your children and with the rest of your family, and how technology is either helping or coming in the way of that. Obviously, be aware of your own usage. So you're modeling your behavior to your teen. So what they see you do, they're going to think is acceptable for them to do. So if you find yourself on your phone a lot when you're around your teen or around other people, or you're constantly on the internet or on the computer not engaging, they're going to see that as an appropriate way of being in the world. So just be aware of whatever you want your teen to do, how you're modeling or maybe not modeling that behavior. Set appropriate boundaries, and again, don't be afraid to set those boundaries and hold to. In terms of setting those boundaries, be willing to look at what really is important. What is the bottom line as far as what you want your teen to be exposed to and how you want them to be behaving. And don't compromise on your boundaries. Be really clear about what's important to you. You might want to consider using shared computers or phones. So in the past, I'm sure a lot of you remember, we used to just have one phone in the house, and it was the landline, and everyone knew who was on that phone and who was calling and who was talking. And now it's a lot harder to keep track of that. So consider ways that you might have more, maybe you'll have one central computer that's okay for your teen to use, where you can easily see what they're doing. There's less potential for secrecy, or maybe them being exposed to things that you just don't want them to be exposed to. And again, make sure just to continually empathize with your teen, whether you agree with them or not, whether you're really clear that you're not going to change a boundary. You can at least communicate to them that you're really hearing what they have to say and that you're understanding how they feel, even if you're not necessarily going to change your agreement.
So whether you decide to establish a family constitution of cyber citizenship, or you sit down and have that difficult talk about sexting, either of these ways are going to help you to connect with your digital native's brain. And you will be connecting to what allows it to be healthy, that is extraordinary, excitable, and robust. You'll be connecting to what allows it to continue growing and continue thriving. And you will be connecting to what may cause it to form bad habits or addictions, to stop growing forever, and to shut down. Thank you so much for your attention tonight, for tuning in. Again, our goal was to help us all think about staying connected with your teen and pets in the digital age.